Hello, welcome to our discussion of evolution. Now remember, this topic is going to be foundational for the rest of the course, so if you have any questions about any of the content in this video, make sure you email me right away and let me know. Now, as I've said in the previous section of this lecture and in our Zoom classes, the foundational idea behind evolution is simple on the surface, but is very complex once you get into the details. What we're going to start with here is a discussion of the basic mechanisms of evolution, but before we can even get into that level of detail, we've got to talk about what the word itself means. You're going to learn over the course of the semester that I'm really big on defining terms. A huge chunk of what you're learning in science is actually just vocabulary. So we all speak a common language about the new concepts and ideas we're introducing. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about what these various words mean. Evolution is best defined as descent with modification. Now that's a pretty fancy definition, but what it boils down to is there are changes within a population of organisms over the course of some unit of time. Now, when we're talking evolution, we don't talk about time in terms of hours or years or even thousands of years. We talk about time in terms of generations. How many generations have passed in the population we're interested in? Descent refers to that idea of generational change. The idea here is that your parents passed on some of their characteristics to you. They in turn got those characteristics from their parents, your grandparents. Your grandparents in turn got their characteristics from your great-grandparents, and you can go on and further and further back as far as you'd like to identify, say, your earliest ancestor with red hair, or your earliest ancestor with blue eyes. The idea is all of our characteristics come from someone that we are descended from. Descendants are the opposite of ancestors. Your ancestors came before you, your descendants come after you. Your children are your descendants, your great-grandchildren are your descendants as well. When we're studying evolution, we're looking for changes in each new generation of a population as those generations are created. That's the modification part of the definition. The changes we're looking for generally are in physical characteristics. But they don't have to be. They can also be changes in behaviors. You can study the evolution of a lot of different aspects of a given population. Now, to make sure all of our terms are defined, let's talk about this word population. It's one that we hear a lot, it's one we use a lot, but it has a very specific meaning. A population is a group of living things Our formal term for living things is the word organism, or in this case, organisms. That are all the same type. Our formal term for that is species. If you and the organisms who live around you are all the same type of organism, it means you are all the same species. A species is a single type of living thing. So as we study evolution, what we're going to be looking for are changes in populations, so groups of living things that are all the same type, over the course of generations in that population. So the big question is, if things are being modified in this population, and we know those things could be characteristics, they could be behaviors, where do those characteristics and behaviors come from? What controls them? Because that controlling factor is what's actually being modified in the population. So we're going to answer that question next. Before we get to that, though, there are two characteristics that a population has to have before it can actually evolve. So not all populations are capable of evolving. They have to have these two characteristics. The first is called heritable variation. Again, it's a bit more jargon. The idea here is that there is variation for certain characteristics in your population. Different versions of a certain physical trait exist. Not everybody has the same fur color. Not everybody has the same eye color. Not everybody's the same size or the same weight. There are variations for all those characteristics of hair color, eye color, size, and weight. It's not enough, though, just to have variation. Those traits and the specific versions of those traits have to be what we call heritable. Heritable means you can pass that trait down to your offspring. So if you're a giraffe with a long neck, your offspring will inherit that characteristic of having a long neck from you. So they too will be long-necked. That happens when specific traits and versions of those traits are controlled by your DNA. Specifically, they're controlled by sections of your DNA called genes. And those genes are what are actually inherited. You can get changes to those traits as well if the DNA itself is changed. This is called mutation. Mutations change traits by literally changing the DNA that controls that trait. This is one way you can get new forms of a characteristic or trait in your population. Okay. So variation are those different versions of the trait, and that variation has to be heritable. You got to be able to pass it down to your offspring. That's our first prerequisite for a population if it wants to evolve. The second is another mouthful. It's differential reproductive success. This is a fancy name for a really simple idea. Some individuals in your population are going to be better at either finding mates and or creating new offspring. It means some individuals are going to be better at having sex, obtaining mates to have sex, and further, they're going to be better at creating babies. What this boils down to is these individuals are better at passing their genes on to the next generation. Okay. If a population has traits that are heritable, they're controlled by DNA, and some individuals in that population are better at getting mates or reproducing than others are, that population may be subject to evolution. Now you know what populations need to have in order to evolve. You know the basic idea behind what evolution is as a process. Now what we're going to do is talk about the actual ways evolution occurs. What are the steps that a population goes through when it's undergoing evolutionary change? There are a few ideas here that we need to talk through before we can really get into the details of evolutionary change itself. You know that genes control physical characteristics. Another way of saying that is just that your genes and the forms of each gene you have are what determine your physical appearance. There's a bunch of terminology that goes along with this that we're going to need to talk through. First, I want to start by drawing out what your DNA actually looks like. A common misconception is that inside each of your cells, you have this one big long strand of DNA. And written into this huge strand of DNA are all the characteristics that describe how you and your body are put together. This is a really common misconception about what DNA actually looks like. Your DNA isn't one big continuous piece. Instead, it's broken into many individual pieces, each of which is a slightly different size. Now notice for each size, I'm drawing two different pieces. That's because you don't have just one set of DNA. You have two sets. Another way to say this is you have two copies of your DNA. So if your DNA is broken into small pieces, it means you've got to have two copies of each of those pieces. So where do these copies come from? It's pretty intuitive if you think about it. You know, half of your genes came from your mom, the other half came from your dad. One of these pieces of DNA you inherited from one parent, and the other piece you inherited from the other parent. That's the same for basically all of the animals that we are going to be talking about. They inherited one copy of DNA from each parent. Organisms that have two sets or two copies of their genome, their DNA, are said to be diploid. Now, there are organisms who only have one copy of their DNA. Frequently, these are organisms who reproduce asexually, meaning there's only one parent, so they only pass down one copy of their DNA. If you have only a single copy, you're said to be haploid. We are mostly going to be working with diploid organisms. Let's focus in on just one piece of DNA, one section. Okay? I'm going to draw in both copies of that piece of DNA. The copy you got from your mom, I'll put M for mom, copy you got from your dad, D for dad. Now, these two pieces of DNA contain the same genes. So, for example, let's pretend that the gene for your hair color is here. If that's the case, then on the matching piece of DNA from your dad, there would also be the gene for hair color in that same location. Same thing with your gene for, let's do something fun. Let's do shoe size. If further down here, you found this gene, which is the gene for shoe size, or foot size, if you rather. Then on the matching piece of DNA from your other parent, you would find that same gene for shoe size. So these matching pieces of DNA have the same genes. So if we were to define the term gene, a good way to do it would be to say that a gene is a section of DNA that codes for a particular characteristic. I'm going to not use the word characteristic, though. Instead, I'm going to use the word character. Here's why. Character is the formal term we use when we're referring to some aspect of an animal's physiology or anatomy. So some physical, some part of their body, some characteristic they have. The characters aren't necessarily very descriptive. They tend to be more like categories. Right? So a character is an aspect of your physical appearance, or actually, let's say, aspect of your physical body. But the trick is, it's a category. Here's what I mean by that. Hair color, eye color, even height refer to parts of your physiology or your anatomy, but they don't give you specifics about them. If I just say to you hair color, you know what I'm talking about, but not exactly what color of hair I'm referring to. There are lots of different possible hair colors. You have red or black, blonde, brown. Same thing with eye color. There's lots of possible eye colors, and there's a whole range of different heights we can have. Characters are categories. They have a lot of variation within them. That variation creates individual versions of a character that we call traits. These are individual versions of a character. So for example, if our character was hair color, possible hair colors could be black, brown, red, and I could go on. Blonde too. Some love to the blondes. So when you start talking about specifically what a character actually looks like, that's called a trait. And there are many traits for any given character. But let's bring this back around to the DNA side of the equation. You know from back here that genes code for characters. So then what codes for traits? It's still the gene, but there must be different versions that a gene can have in order to create those different versions of a character. That's definitely true. In order to get individual characters, you need to have individual versions of each gene. These different versions of a gene are called alleles. So these are the different versions of a gene that code for traits. Now, if you see how I've drawn this out, on one side of this dotted line, you've got genes and characters. These two concepts are linked. Genes are what code for characters. On the other side of the line, you've got alleles and traits. These two concepts are linked. Alleles are what code for traits. Let's get back to talking about our two copies of DNA up here. You've probably picked up that what I have drawn for you are two different genes, and each of those genes is coding for a character, either hair color or shoe size. Now let's talk about how traits and alleles work into this equation. Our hair color gene that we inherited from our mother might code for, let's say, blonde hair. So I'm going to replace hair color with something more specific. I'm going to say that from our mother, we inherited the allele, the specific version of the gene, for blonde hair. From our dad, we also could have inherited the blonde version of the gene. Both of our parents could have had the same hair color. Totally possible. But just to make this fun, let's say instead we inherited a different allele from our dad. Let's say instead of inheriting the blonde allele, we inherited the allele for red hair. Okay. Now, what's going to determine what color of hair we actually have? We've got two different alleles here. We've got one for blonde, one for red. So what color hair is ours going to be? Well, we could make this brown hair. Okay. So what color hair is ours going to be? We've got an allele here for blonde hair from our mom. We've got an allele here for brown hair from our dad. So what determines our hair color? Well, not all alleles are equal. Some alleles are dominant over others. And those others are called recessive alleles. In this example, the brown allele is dominant, while our blonde allele is recessive. What that means is our hair color is going to be brown. The dominant allele, this is an important thing to know, the dominant allele controls your physical appearance. So if you have both a copy of the dominant allele and the recessive, the only one that you'll be able to see the effect of is the dominant. So if you have both the brown and blonde allele, your dominant brown allele will control your hair color. So you will have brown hair. But you know blondes exist. People have blonde hair. The only way that a recessive allele and the trait that it codes for can show up in a person is if you have two copies of that recessive allele. Okay. So you can only get the recessive version of a character if you have two copies of the recessive allele. To make all this easier to summarize, we use shorthand to refer to the dominant and recessive alleles for a certain gene. The dominant allele is always referred to using a capital letter. So for example, brown hair would be represented with a capital B. The recessive allele is, as you probably guessed, always referred to using the lowercase version, but of that same letter. So for example, blonde, it would be a lowercase letter, and in this case it would be a lowercase b, to make it very clear that these are two versions of the same character. We're talking hair color in both cases. So when we refer to a single individual's, what's called their genotype, what we're actually writing out are the versions of the gene that they have, what alleles an individual has for a certain gene. So in this case, the genotype for our individual would be capital B, lowercase b. Those are the actual alleles that individual has. But what's their physical appearance? What we call their phenotype, what they actually look like. Well, since you know that brown hair is dominant, this individual has a copy of the dominant brown allele. This person has brown hair. In this case, just knowing the phenotype, which is what you can see, it's the aspect of your genetics that shows on your body, it doesn't actually tell you what your complete genetic composition is for that character. You know, if you have brown hair, you must have at least one copy of the brown allele. But that means you could have also a hidden copy of your recessive allele. But it's equally possible you could have two copies of that dominant brown allele. There's no way for you to know just by looking in the mirror. The only time that phenotypes and genotypes match, the only time you can tell an individual's phenotype for sure from their genotype is here. It's if you have an individual who has the recessive version of the character. If you've got the recessive version, there's only one way you can get it. You have to have two copies of the recessive allele. Only recessive phenotypes tell you with certainty what the genotype is for that individual's gene, for that trait. Now, how does all this come together and help us understand evolution? It's going to be easiest to explain if I walk you through an example. We're going to talk about color in beetles. All right, imagine you've got this starter population of beetles. Some are brown, some are green. In fact, on this diagram, if you were to count up the individuals, you would find you've got 5 brown and 1 green. But if we look closer, we can see what their genotype is for that color gene. The brown squiggly line represents 1 copy of the brown allele. The green squiggly line represents 1 copy of the green allele. And using just that information, we can tell which allele is dominant and which is recessive. This individual beetle has 1 copy of each. He's got a brown allele and a green allele. But physically, he's brown. If you have 1 copy of each allele, the dominant one will control your phenotype, your physical appearance. What that tells us is brown must be dominant, which makes green recessive. Now, there are more brown beetles than there are green beetles. That might lead you to think that the brown allele is more common in the population than the green allele. Let's see if that's actually true. Let's count up the number of alleles we have. Okay. So we've got 5 brown beetles, but how many brown alleles are there? Well, if we count them, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many green alleles are there? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plot twist, 6. The brown allele and the green allele are equally common. Even though the vast majority of the population has that brown character, at the genetic level, the 2 traits are equally common. This is one of the first key ideas I want you to see, is that looks can be deceiving. This goes back to the idea that morphology or physical appearance can sometimes be misleading. It doesn't necessarily tell you what the genetic composition is of your population. It might seem like there's more brown DNA in the population than green, and yet that's not the case. We just demonstrated it. Okay. So let's look at this population as a whole, and I'll show you where I'm going with all of this. We start out with a population of beetles that phenotypically are mostly brown, but genetically are evenly split between brown and green. Out of that original population, we are going to grab 3 beetles, 2 greens and a brown. Now you know, because green is recessive, that these green beetles must each have 2 copies of the green allele. So there's a minimum of 4 copies of that green allele in this little group. But how many greens are there in this brown beetle? There's no way to know. We know for sure that there's got to be 1 brown allele because that beetle is brown. But his second allele could be brown or green. What happens if we let this group breed? We let these 3 beetles reproduce, we let their offspring reproduce, and we come and check back in a couple generations. Here's what we'd see. Vast majority of the beetles are now green. That's not through any great surprising mechanism. The majority of the alleles in our starting population were green. Could be that our brown beetle had a hidden green allele as well, so this number could have been as high as 5. When the majority of the genes in your population are one form, it makes sense for most of the beetles to have that form as well, or most of the individuals in your population to take that form as well. Okay? If the green allele is the most common allele, most of your beetles are likely going to be green. But what if we check back in 5 or 10 generations and we see this? Clearly something has changed. Something happened while we were away. Something that caused the population to shift towards becoming brown. In this situation, it's likely that the brown allele is now the most common. So up here, the green allele was most common. But now down here, it's the brown allele. Something shifted. Something caused green coloration to no longer be as common. The mechanisms of evolution are part of what determine that change, that reason. They're what answer the question of why. Why did this population change from being mostly green to mostly brown? The way that we measure this change is by counting these alleles. How many copies of a given allele are there in one generation of your population? And how does that number change in future generations? The way that we can explain our definition of evolution using genetics is to say that genetic differences are passed on from one generation to the next, parents to offspring. This is that heritable variation component. One of the major aspects of evolution is that genes that specifically produce advantageous traits or traits that help you survive, they're going to become more common in a population in subsequent generations. The reason is individuals who have those genes will have an easier time surviving and reproducing, and they'll pass those good survivor genes onto their own offspring, who in turn will have an easier time surviving and reproducing. This is going to cause the characteristics of the population to change over time. How do we measure this? It's by counting those alleles, counting those genetic changes. The commonness of a gene, how common a gene is in a population, is referred to as its frequency. Formally, we say that evolution happens when there are changes in gene frequency in a population over the course of generations. And that's what we saw in our beetles. We went from having an original population that had equal gene frequencies. The brown allele and the green allele were equal in frequency. Our smaller population wound up having more green than brown. There were more green alleles than brown alleles in this small population. The larger population that descended from them, same thing. More green alleles than brown. But then something shifted. Something happened while we were away that caused the population to move in the opposite direction, so that brown alleles were now more common than green. We haven't explained why. We've just noted that there was a change in the frequency of each allele. But that's enough. That counts as evolution. And that is how we numerically measure it.